Dearest viewers, how are you doing all? Today, what if I told you there's a magical world where the moon never sets, and the queen who controls it hasn't moved for hundreds of years? A curious fairy breaks the most forbidden rule and flies straight into the sky, only to discover a terrifying secret hidden inside the moon itself. Because the Moon Queen isn't ruling Fairy Wonderland, she's trapped, and something ancient, something dark, is starting to wake up. Now the fate of an entire magical world depends on one fearless fairy, who must choose between freedom or becoming a prisoner of the moon forever. The story unfolds like this. The Evermoon hung high above, a silver eye that never blinked, never closed, and never looked away. Its light did not fall, it pressed down, coating the world of Wonderland in a layer of cold, static brilliance. Below the forest floor was a stage of endless motion. Fairies moved in synchronized loops, their feet striking the ground in a rhythm that had not varied for centuries. They danced because the light demanded it, spinning through the same arcs, repeating the same gestures, and tracing the same paths over and over again. There were no shadows here. The light was too absolute, too offensive to allow for the relief of darkness. Every leaf, every petal, and every wing was illuminated with a harsh, clinical clarity that stripped away all mystery. The air remained still, devoid of the natural currents that once carried the scent of change or the promise of a coming storm. The fairies continued their dance, their movements fluid but hollow, trapped in a cycle that offered no beginning and no conclusion. High above the rhythmic pulse of the forest, Naira hovered, her wings beating a rhythm that defied the still air. She did not join the dance. While the others spun in their endless, predictable loops, she remained still, her gaze locked onto the silver eye of the Evermoon, her wings glowing and shimmering, full with a restless energy that felt alien in this place of absolute order. She watched the way the light hit the ground, searching for a single, dark sliver of relief, but found none. Every surface was flat, bleached, and hollow. She tilted her head, tracking the moon's unblinking glare, and felt a cold knot of suspicion tighten in her chest. Where was the depth? Where was the breath of the night? The Moon Queen remained a myth etched in silence, a ruler who demanded perfection but provided no substance. Naira shifted her weight, the air around her vibrating with the friction of her disagreement. She looked at the moon and saw not a guardian, but a cage. The silence of the queen was not peace. It was a refusal to answer. Naira's wings flared, catching the harsh light and scattering it into pointed, prismatic fragments. She looked at the moon one last time, her eyes narrowing as the decision took root in her blood. Naira did not wait for the next cycle of the dance. She banked hard, her wings snapping open to catch the still air, and shot upward like a splinter of glass. Below, the elder fairies sensed the disruption. Their heads turned in unison, their eyes tracking her direction with a cold, mechanical accuracy. She ignored them, driving her wings into a frantic, uneven rhythm that tore through the stillness. She bypassed the inner circle, weaving between the towering branches. Every beat of her wings felt like pushing against hardening wax. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with the weight of centuries of enforced order. She climbed higher, her muscles burning as she fought the density of the sky. The light above began to shift, turning from a flat white to a breakable, piercing silver. She felt the resistance increase, the air thickening into a solid wall that demanded she stop, turn back, and rejoin the rhythm. She refused. She pushed harder, her wings blurring into a haze of shimmering motion, carving a path through the suffocating stillness. The forest floor shrank to a pinprick of light, and the moon loomed closer, a massive, unyielding barrier. She did not look down again. The air shattered. It did not just grow thin, it turned against her. A sudden, violent pressure slammed into Naira's chest, forcing the breath from her lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. The sky, once a silent void, erupted into a chaotic swirl of phantom storms. Sharp currents of light lashed out like whips, striking her wings and sending tremors through her frame. She tried to bank, but the wind shifted, carrying voices that sounded like her own, hollow, defeated, and small. They whispered of the times she had failed to find the rhythm, of the moments she had stumbled in the dance, and of the unavoidable consequence of her resistance. She shook her head, but the sound followed, a low, rhythmic thrumming that mimicked the heartbeat of the forest below. Every beat became a struggle against the gravity of her own history. She saw the ground far below, a flat, white areas that seemed to mock her ambition. She gritted her teeth, ignored the voices, and drove her wings harder against the storm. She was not a leaf to be blown, she was the wind itself. The sky twisted. Before her eyes, the world warped into a singular, terrifying image. She was no longer a flyer, but a withered leaf, brown and brittle, spiraling downward into a vast, uncaring void. The vision was absolute. It drained the heat from her wings and the strength from her core. She watched herself fall, a discarded fragment of the forest, destined to vanish into the static floor below. The silence of the void screamed in her ears, promising an end to the struggle. Then, she stopped fighting the vision, and instead leaned into the descent. She folded her wings, turned her body into a blade, and dove directly through the center of the phantom leaf. The illusion shattered like ice under a hammer. The air instantly turned thin, breakable, and impossibly cold. The pressure that had been crushing her chest vanished, replaced by a sharp, metallic bite that burned in her lungs. She snapped her wings open, the shimmering dust catching the harsh, unfiltered light of the moon. The silence here possessed a weight of its own. Naira hovered in the thin, breakable air, her wings pulsing with a faint, rhythmic glow that seemed out of place against the absolute stillness of the lunar surface. Before her, the horizon shifted. A structure of frozen light rose from the void, its geometry defying the natural curves of the world below. It was a palace carved from solidified radiance, sharp-edged and towering, casting no shadows even under the intense glare of the evermoon. She drifted closer, but the air grew dense with a low-frequency hum that rattled her teeth and made her vision blur. The palace was not merely a building, it was a machine of static perfection. She landed on a platform of polished, translucent stone that felt like ice against her skin. Every step echoed, not with sound, but with a vibration that traveled through her boots and up her spine. She reached the main entrance, two massive, translucent doors that stood as tall as the ancient oaks. She braced her shoulders and pushed. With a sharp, crystalline crack, the doors gave way. She stumbled forward into a realm where the air hummed. The interior of the palace was a cavern of blinding brilliance. Naira took a step, her boots clicking against a floor of solidified starlight that felt breakable under her weight. The air here was not just thin, it was still trapped in a loop of a single, dying frequency that vibrated in her marrow. At the center of the hall sat a throne carved from a single, pointed piece of lunar crystal. It hummed, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to anchor the entire structure to the void. The Moon Queen sat upon it, motionless. Her skin was a pale, translucent white, reflecting the harsh glare of the room like a mirror. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a distant point beyond the walls, unblinking and lack of recognition. She was not a ruler presiding over a court. She was a fixture of the architecture itself. Naira moved closer, her wings twitching in the oppressive atmosphere. She reached out to touch the edge of the throne, but the air around it rippled with a static discharge that forced her to recoil. The queen did not turn her head. She remained locked in place, a prisoner of her own radiance, tied up to the throne by a web of shimmering, invisible energy. The realization hit Naira with the force of a physical blow. The queen was not maintaining the light was maintaining the queen, keeping her suspended in a state of eternal, silent decay. The queen's lips parted, a movement so slow it seemed to defy the passage of time. Her voice emerged, thin and breakable, sounding like glass grinding against stone.
"You were not meant to witness this,"
she whispered. The words hung in the still air, vibrating against the walls. As the sound disappeared, a sharp, metallic whine erupted from beneath the throne. Naira stepped back, her boots skidding on the polished surface. A hairline fracture appeared in the floor, glowing with a sickly, pale light. It widened, snaking outward in a path toward the base of the throne. The floor groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that shook the entire palace. Then, the surface buckled. From the widening opening, a dark, viscous shadow began to seep upward. It moved with a deliberate, oily consistency, smelling of ancient, forgotten dust. The shadow pooled around the base of the throne, coiling like a living thing. Naira watched, her wings held tight against her back. The queen's eyes finally shifted, tracking the encroaching stain with a look of profound, weary recognition. The foundation of the moon was failing. The shadow did not only pool, it gushed. It wrapped around the crystal base of the throne, thick and hungry, its surface rippling like disturbed oil. Where the darkness touched the light, the air hissed, a sharp sound of opposing forces grinding against one another. The queen's form began to stumble, her shadow blurred, flickering in and out of existence, as if she were a candle flame, struggling against a storm. She gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, but her fingers passed through the crystal as if it were smoke. The throne groaned, a sound of fracturing stone that echoed through the vast, hollow hall. Each pulse of the darkness drew a tremor from the floor.
"The seal is broken,"
the queen said, her voice now a fragmented echo, layered with the sound of wind rushing through a canyon.
"If I fall, the night will shatter into 1,000 pointed pieces."
The darkness climbed higher, coiling around her waist, pulling her toward the opening. The entire structure of the moon tilted, a sickening shift in gravity that forced Naira to dig her heels into the floor. The light was failing. Naira watched the darkness coil upward, but her gaze sharpened. She looked past the hunger of the shadow, past the way it tore at the light, and saw a pattern. It was not a monster. It was a missing piece, a pointed fragment of a puzzle that had been forced apart for too long. The palace walls shuddered, yet she did not retreat. She did not reach for the blade at her side, nor did she summon the light. Instead, she took a steadying breath, the air tasting of ozone and ancient forgotten dust. She stepped into the pool of shadow. The cold hit her skin like a physical weight, a numbing pressure that sought to slow her pulse. She ignored the warning of her own senses. She moved closer to the throne, where the viscous smoke swirled in thick, oily ribbons. She extended her arms, her fingers radiated, and plunged her hands directly into the heart of the swirling dark. The substance clung to her skin, freezing and heavy, yet she did not wince. Naira braced her feet against the vibrating floor and hauled the mass of shadow toward the throne. The darkness resisted, a thick, viscous weight that pulled at her shoulders and strained her muscles. As she forced the smoke into the heart of the moon's radiance, the air snapped. A blinding flash of violet light erupted, instantly followed by a searing streak of gold. The two forces did not blend. They collided with the force of a physical impact. A sound like grinding metal and shattering glass tore through the hall, a high-pitched scream that vibrated in Naira's teeth. She held her ground, her arms trembling as the energy currents whipped around her. Violet sparks showered the floor. The throne groaned, tilting violently as the light and shadow locked in a chaotic, swirling vortex. Naira's hands were buried deep in the center of the storm, feeling the heat of the gold and the numbing frost of the dark. The air inside the palace became a solid wall of pressure. Naira felt the heat of the gold light searing her palms, while the freezing shadow bled into her marrow, turning her veins to ice. Her wings, extended to their full span, caught the backlash of the collision. Feathers frayed and curled under the intensity of the violet discharge, yet she did not pull back. She dug her heels into the shifting floor, feeling the crystalline surface spiderweb beneath her weight. The palace groaned, a deep, structural protest that vibrated through her chest. She had to move now, or the entire moon would shatter. She closed her eyes, ignoring the blinding glare, and focused on the resistance of the two currents. With a grunt of exertion, she shifted her grip. She stopped fighting the collision and began to guide it. She pulled a thread of shadow, twisting it through a ribbon of gold, forcing the two extremes to interlock. Her hands moved in a rhythmic, sweeping motion, dragging the viscous dark into the brilliant light. The chaos began to yield to her rhythm. The final threads of shadow coiled around the throne, resisting the pull of the light. Naira locked her fingers, forcing the dark mass to merge with the gold. A sudden, violent tremor shook the palace foundation. Beneath her feet, the crystalline floor split, long pointed openings racing toward the walls. The moon's core groaned. A deep sound echoes. Naira lunged forward, pressing her palms directly against the widening cracks, pouring the combined energy. The light flared, blindingly white, then settled into a deep, steady violet. The opening stopped their crawl. With a sharp, audible click, the floor fused back together, the seams glowing with a faint, pulsing rhythm. Naira pulled her hands away, her skin tingling from the residual charge. The throne stopped humming. The silence in the hall was no longer heavy, it was expectant. Beneath the floor, the deep violet glow began to expand and contract. It was not a flicker, but a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The moon was breathing. Naira watched as the light, once a flat and oppressive glare, softened at the edges. It pulsed outward, pushing against the translucent walls of the palace. With every expansion, the light dimmed into a rich, velvet indigo, and with every contraction, it flared into a warm, golden radiance. The palace structure responded to the rhythm. The walls, previously frozen and brittle, began to ripple like water under a gentle breeze. The static perfection of the moon's surface was dissolving. Naira stepped back, her boots leaving faint impressions on the floor that now felt supple rather than rigid. She looked toward the horizon through the palace doors. For the first time, the light did not hit the world below as a singular, unyielding beam. It moved, it shifted. As the moon pulsed, the light stretched across the distant forests, dragging long, soft shadows behind every tree and stone. The cycle of day and night had finally begun to turn. The Moon Queen remained fixed to the throne, her posture rigid as the stone beneath her. The seat hummed with a final, dying vibration before going silent. As the last of the static energy drained into the floor, the heavy, invisible weight that had pinned her for ages evaporated. The throne, once a monolith of frozen light, began to crack and dull, its sharp edges softening into translucent dust. The queen blinked, her gaze shifting from the distant horizon to her own hands. She pressed her palms against the armrests and pushed. Her legs, pale and trembling, caught her weight for the first time. She did not rise gracefully. She stumbled, her feet sliding on the now supple surface of the floor. She gripped the edge of the throne for balance, her knuckles white, before finding her center. She took a single, shaky step forward, then another. The gravity that had anchored her to the seat was gone. She stood tall, her form no longer flickering like a dying candle, but solid and steady. She looked down at her feet, testing the ground, then turned to face Naira. The silence between them was no longer oppressive. It was the quiet of a new beginning. The Moon Queen stepped to the edge of the palace, her eyes fixed on the world below. She raised a hand, and the moon responded. The silver orb, long held in a state of unyielding fullness, began to pull inward. The edges of the light curved, softening into a gentle arc. It was the first wane in an eternity of static glare. As the moon narrowed, the light hitting the forests of Wonderland shifted its angle. For the first time, the trees did not stand in a flat, washed-out glow. They cast long, dark lines across the mossy floor. The shadows were soft, stretching and receding as the moon continued its slow, rhythmic retreat. Every rock and stream gained a new dimension, defined by the contrast of the encroaching dark. The forest floor, once a uniform sheet of brightness, broke into a complex tapestry of light and shade. Naira watched from the palace, her wings catching the dimming radiance. The world below was no longer a frozen stage. It was a landscape of depth, texture, and movement. The shadows crawled over the roots of the ancient trees, bringing a sense of relief to the still earth. The moon was no longer a cold, unblinking eye, but a shifting, living crescent. Below, in the heart of the forest, the fairies stopped their rhythmic, static dance. The ground beneath their feet, once bathed in a flat, relentless silver, now held patches of cool, gray shade. They looked up, necks craning toward the sky. The moon was no longer a piercing, unblinking eye. It was a soft, curved sliver. A fairy near the edge of the stream knelt, reaching out to touch the darkness pooling at the base of a fern. She did not recoil. She traced the edge of the shadow, her fingers moving through the dimness as if testing its texture. A group of them gathered around a stone that had been obscured by the previous glare. Now, the shadow cast by the rock gave it shape, revealing the mossy ridges and deep crevices of its surface. They moved closer, their gazes shifting from the light to the dark with wide, curious eyes. There was no panic. No one tried to flee the encroaching dusk. Instead, they walked into the shadows, letting the cool air settle against their skin. Naira stepped out from the palace of frozen light. The air outside was no longer breakable. It felt thick, alive, and moving. She spread her wings. They caught the wind, but the movement was different now. Where once they had been translucent, they now shimmered with a dual essence. Veins of gold pulsed against patches of deep, velvet shadow. She pushed off the ledge and dropped toward the forest. The descent was not a fall, but a glide through the layers of the new atmosphere. She banked left, watching the way the shadow trailed from her wingtips, weaving into the silver light of the moon. She landed on the highest branch of an ancient oak, her feet gripping the bark. She looked at her hands, then back at the shifting landscape. The world below was no longer a stage of static perfection. It was a breathing, changing cycle. She had not just saved the moon, she had dismantled the machine that kept the world frozen. She was the architect of this new reality. She folded her wings, watching the light dim and brighten, content in the knowledge that the cycle had finally begun. Naira stepped onto a broad, glowing petal that drifted just above the canopy. It dipped under her weight, then steadied, suspended in the cool night air. She sat, drawing her knees to her chest, and looked up. The moon had thinned into a sharp silver crescent. It was no longer a static, unblinking eye, but a shifting vessel of time. She watched the way the darkness cradled the sliver of light, giving it edge, giving it form. Without the encroaching shadow, the glow would have been nothing but a blinding, flat glare. She traced the curve of the moon with her gaze, feeling the rhythm of the world pulsing beneath her. The air moved in soft, predictable currents. The forest below breathed in the cool dark and exhaled in the warm light. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence that was no longer empty, but full of potential. The cycle was complete. She remained there, a silent observer of the balance she had woven, knowing that the light finally held meaning because the dark was there to hold it.